Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be reviewing the third round series Western Conference Finals between the San Jose Sharks and the St. Louis Blues, in which the Sharks lost 4-2. So the Blues moved on to the Stanley Cup Finals to face off against the St. Louis Blues, with the winner getting the all-important prize, the Stanley Cup. So my original prediction for this series was a 4-2. However, I had the Sharks coming up on top, and that looked good-ish at the start of the series, especially once after Game 3, but the Sharks managed to do what they had always done in these playoffs, which was fail to run away with a series lead, as they once again lost twice while having a series lead, up 1-0 after Game 1, up 2-1 after Game 3, losing the next game each time. For the X factors of the series, I pointed to the Sharks' depth. Past their first line onto the second line and third line, I was looking for a big performance because I said the Blues were a deep team, and we saw how deep the Blues really were. Their fourth line of Steen, Barbashev, and Sundqvist were doing very, very well basically every single game. The first line was effective, but so was their second and third line, and of course I just mentioned the fourth line, so they got contributions up and down the lineup, while the Sharks, it was here and there. Game 3 was a huge game for the third line, but otherwise it just wasn't really good enough, and that was one of the major reasons why during the last 3 games of this series the Sharks only managed to score 2 goals. One of the other X factors I had right below this, but still very important, was the Sharks' power play, which also managed to disappoint in this series. They didn't get so many chances that there were, a lot of times to turn it around, but they got enough that it could have made a difference, and they just didn't execute correctly. They had only 2 power play goals in this series, one in Game 4, one in Game 1, and the one in Game 1 was on a 5-on-3, and so not very strong performance from the Sharks' power play either. So both of the X factors that I felt were required for them to actually take this series did not show up, and so it's not really a huge wonder why they end up losing this. Of course, there are other reasons, however. For the St. Louis Blues, I did have as the X factor Jordan Binnington, who didn't actually end up being as impactful. Of course, Binnington played pretty well, but he really wasn't a huge part, and he sort of just ebbed and flowed with his team. During the first 3 games, when his team was not playing very good defense and was giving up tons of turnovers, Binnington didn't really have the best numbers to show. But during the last 3 games, when the Sharks somewhat let up offensively and the Blues were playing some really suffocating defense, Binnington didn't really have to do all too much to sustain very good stats over the last 3 games, and in fact the 2 goals that he actually did let in were on potentially stoppable shots, definitely in Game 4, maybe not so much in Game 6, and so Binnington could have even had better stats if he was maybe more aware on a couple of those goals, because the St. Louis Blues defense was just so strong during the last 3, and so the X factor for the Blues didn't end up being Binnington, it ended up being their defensive core of Pietrangelo and Parayko especially, and all the other players like Edmondson and Bouwmeester. But this series started out as the first 2 for the Sharks did, with a Game 1 victory. It actually went rather well. They looked like the better team in this one, and it looked like as though the Blues seemed more focused on throwing hits than they did in playing hockey. And so the Sharks ended up winning 6-3. It got a bit close at the end, but they had a 3-goal lead going into the first period, so it really wasn't all that bad. And so the Sharks were looking to finally be able to capitalize on a series lead and make it go somewhere. But again, it just wouldn't happen. It came into Game 2 still in San Jose. They trailed 2-0. They managed to come back with 2 Logan Couture goals to make it 2-2, but then they gave up 1 to Bertuzzo, and they could never close that 1-goal gap until Sundqvist made it 4-2, and the Sharks ended up splitting once again on home ice. But there was still hope. As they went into Game 3, they were up 2-0. They ended up just completely blowing that lead, allowing the St. Louis Blues back in the second period. Ended up down 4-3 going into the first, but unlike in Game 2, they actually managed to close the gap this time, tied it up at 4, went into overtime where we had a huge controversial call where no call, where Timo Meier bats this puck out of the air, no hand pass is called, and the Sharks end up winning it in overtime, and they have a 2-1 lead with the ability to at the very least split in St. Louis, so home ice was back in favor of the San Jose Sharks. Game 4 came along, and while the Sharks weren't that great in the first period and ended up giving up a couple of pretty lucky bounce goals to the St. Louis Blues to put themselves down 2-0, They really took control somewhat of the game in the last 40 minutes, but it just wasn't really enough to close the deficit this time. They got one goal from Tomas Hertl to make it 2-1, but nothing more than that because of the Blues' defense, as I talked about. And then the Sharks ended up splitting in St. Louis, and we went back to San Jose with the series tied at 2. But the Sharks were no stranger to a position like this. They did the exact same thing actually the exact same thing, even in terms of which team won each game in the previous round against the Colorado Avalanche. And what happened in Game 5 of that round? Well, they came out with a rather dominant performance, ended up winning 2-1 and taking a 3-2 series lead on the road with the ability to end in Game 6, and if not, fall back to Game 7, which they had to do there. But in this one, the Sharks played their worst game of the series, potentially even their worst game of the playoffs, putting up a completely disastrous performance in Game 5, including the fact that they got a couple of players injured due to some pretty dirty hits from St. Louis Blues players, and so the Sharks end up losing 5-0. They end up losing both Tomas Hertl and Joe Pavelski for Game 6, and they're going on the road down 3-2 in a series, an elimination game here with not that much hope. They come into Game 6, however, and while the first period is once again not good enough for the Sharks as they fall behind again 2-0, they end up bringing it back a bit in the second and third period. They make it 2-1, but the Blues, as they've been doing for the last half of this series, the first 3 games weren't great, but their last 3 were very good defensively, as I said. They managed to hold the Sharks off. Obviously, there were a couple bounces that didn't go the Sharks' way. A couple of posts were hit, but eventually the Blues would hold off the Sharks enough to get a goal to make it 4-1 and then an empty netter to make it 5-1, and that did it for the series. The Blues, with only giving up 2 goals in the last 3 games of the series, secured the 6-game series victory. Revenge for what the Sharks did to them back in 2016 when the Sharks had won in 6 games. Offensive contributors of the series, and you could see sort of what went wrong here for the San Jose Sharks. They had Couture leading the way with 4 goals, 1 assist, and 5 points, which seems pretty good at the very least. But the thing is that all of his points came within just the first couple of games of this series. Only in Game 1 and Game 2 did he actually manage to get any points. The same will go for Timo Meier, who also had 2 goals and 2 assists for 4 points. Erik Karlsson, at the very least, helped the Sharks win Game 3, and he had a point in Game 4 at least, but he didn't actually end up playing much in Game 5 or Game 6 to even help the team because of his injury. And then Joe Thornton with 2 goals and 2 assists for 4 points, also the majority of those points coming within Game 3. And so all of the Sharks' offense was sort of centered in the first 3 games, and then when that first line of Couture and Meier and Nyquist also fell off after the first 3 games, there was no depth to carry them, as there hasn't been basically since the start of the Colorado series. For the goaltending, it was Martin Jones, of course, a 3.68 GAA and a .869 save percentage. Obviously, still small sample size of just 6 games, but you can definitely say that all in all, across the entire series, this was probably the worst series for Jones in these playoffs. Yes, you could obviously point to the games 2-4 of the Golden Knights series as being worst games as a whole, but if you take into account games 5, 6, and 7, and even 1, you could probably say that series was better than this one. He was only really great in Game 4 and potentially in Game 1. Otherwise, he was mostly just average. And so these stats are worse than how he did play, because the Sharks sort of reverted to early season San Jose in the last couple of games, where they were basically controlling the play offensively, but then when they would give up chances, it would be like grade A chances. And so it was obviously tough for Jones. So the stats are a bit worse than how he played, but it is sort of indicative of how the series went. The Blues managed to find holes onto Martin Jones, and while he was average, it wasn't really good enough, as was not, most of his team basically wasn't really good enough. Onto the Blues, and we see Tarasenko leading the way with 3 goals, 5 assists, and 8 points. Tarasenko did what none of the Sharks forwards managed to do, which was remain consistent over the entire series. He put up at least a single point in every single game, and Tarasenko never really had a game where he was actually dominant, unlike someone like Couture and Meier and Thornton, who actually had very dominant games, times where they were the best player on the ice. Tarasenko never had that, but I would probably trade a dominant performance from Couture in Game 1 and I guess also Game 2, but nothing for the last 4 games, for someone who was actually able to put up at the very least a point or even 2 points in each game, which is what Tarasenko did. Yeah, he didn't play super well in really any of these games. Yeah, he wasn't always extremely apparent, but he always found a way to at least get 1 point. Then David Perron with 3 goals, 4 assists, and 7 points. Surprisingly very good performance from David Perron. Schwartz with 4 goals, 1 assist, and 5 points. Most of those coming in his hat trick in Game 5. And then O'Reilly, a goal, 4 assists, and 5 points. Most of those coming in a hat trick of assists in Game 6. For Binnington, his stats were pretty good, a 2.32 GAA and a .912 save percentage. As I said, Binnington didn't start the series off too well, mostly because the Blues were getting a lot of turnovers, but once the Blues defensively cleaned things up, Binnington was able to make most of the saves he needed to make, even if he let squeak through a couple, and so the Blues ended up taking this series. So the Sharks had some issues in this one, the lack of depth, lack of power play, other factors such as injuries. They couldn't really respond to the physical play, and when the Blues sort of crossed the line, they weren't really punished for crossing that line, and so in the end, it was the Blues taking the series. They'll face the Boston Bruins, and the Sharks will be the second to last team to go home in these 2019 Stanley Cup playoffs. Class dismissed.